Good morning, everyone. Today is the final day for the Bodh Gaya Dialogues, and we will be beginning today with a talk by Dr. Shashank Shekhar Sinha, author, independent researcher, and publishing director at Routledge, South Asia. The topic of his conversation is going to be on Bodh Gaya and beyond, the larger geocultural connections and histories of the Mahabodhi temple complex. Before I give the floor to him, let me briefly introduce the speaker for today. Dr. Shashank Shekhar Sinha is an independent researcher, author, and a publisher. He has been working as publishing director at Routledge, South Asia since 2012. He has been on key research and higher education committees of institutions like Indian Council of Social Science Research, Indian Council for Historical Research, and National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore. Dr. Sinha is the author of Restless Mothers and Turbulent Daughters, Situating Tribes in Gender Studies, and Delhi, Agra, Fatehpur Sikri, Monuments, Cities, and Connected Histories. He is currently co-editing the volume Gender in Modern India, History, Culture, Marginality for Oxford University Press, UK. With a view to highlight the gaps between academic and popular understandings of history, Dr. Sinha also writes for popular media platforms and features in television programs as well. We welcome you, Dr. Shekhar, and the floor is yours.
A very good morning to all of you. I understand the problem of parallel sessions happening, so whoever could stay here, a special thank you for that. I think I'll first begin with thanking Deshkal Society. Its visible faces to me like Sanjay, Surabhi, Kunjan, but also people who've been working backstage to make this possible. So special thanks to them to allow me to share my thoughts with all of you. I noticed that there were 3 entry points for the Bodh Gaya Dialogues. One was heritage, one was philosophy, and one was sustainable development. So I am entering this dialogue through the heritage window, right? And my point of, my presentation will have 2 parts. The first part is about history, the dilemmas that a historian faces, especially with a very complex site like Bodh Gaya, particularly with training in historical methods. And my second part is when the dialogue shifts to other people as well. So there I become more of an ethnographer, and this dialogue becomes a multi-log, right? So let me first begin with the first part, where I talk about Bodh Gaya as a kind of a dialogue, to use the Bodh Gaya Dialogues format, So it's a dialogue, basically. When I say a heritage of Bodh Gaya, I see it as a kind of a very complex dialogue between history and faith. And particularly with people who have been trained in history writing, how do they see it as there? Right? And even the historical period is a pretty long one, right? It's from 3rd century BC to around, perhaps earlier. I'm not talking about when the Buddha came here. I'm talking about from whence you have this pilgrimages and other evidence of pilgrimage and other starts, basically. So till about 19th century, when the colonial administration recasts this temple. So that's the first phase. Now, the entry of various ideas, actors, cultures, and geographies makes this dialogue a very complex one. So at different point of time, different ideas, different actors, different cultures, and different geographies enter this dialogue. This dialogue where the historian and faith are asking questions to each other. How do we deal with this situation like Bodh Gaya? And part 2 is when this dialogue, when the past and present ask questions to each other, which is where I'm talking about. I remember that I was having with friends, some conversations at the breakfast table, basically today. This is where the present asks questions to the past. So I'm talking about the 21st century. So two parts of this dialogue. First, where the historian and faith ask questions to each other. And second, when the dialogue becomes a multi-log, where more other players start entering this dialogue, and the dialogue assumes more complex things. So people like ethnographers, town planners, developers. So the dialogue between historian and faith becomes a multi-log where other ideas. And this interplay of all these things, the ideas, the actors, the geographies and cultures, is what gives is a much larger geocultural connections which goes beyond Bodh Gaya. And this is what I'm going to talk about. And I talk about it through 7 frames. So I give you 7 windows within the heritage window, right? And this 7 frame will say that how history works with faith and how present asks questions to the past, basically. And my first window to this is what it talks about the balance between intangible and tangible, something that Gunjan was talking about yesterday, who was introducing me. Now, one of those interesting parts of it is basically, and there are 2 aspects to it. One is a textual tradition where it is ascribed that Buddha, when he was dying, basically, he was asked, how do we worship you? Or how do we take your legacy forward? And he says that you go to these 4 points, basically, where I was born, where I attained enlightenment, where I preached my first sermon, and then where I died, basically, right? And then later traditions made it sometimes 8 points or 8 events in the life of Buddha. Now, why I'm saying this and how does this pose dialogue for history? How does this pose problems or questions for history? All these 8 events or 4 events have become monumentalized, right? Artifacts, they have become artifacts, or they become very important in Buddhist iconography, either in form of sculptures or paintings or anything. So these 4 events or 8 events, depending on how the textual traditions see it, all these things become monumentalized. You can see them in the form of carving, you can see them in the form of the sculptures, you can see them in the form of paintings and drawings, basically, right? So if you go to Sanchi, for instance, it's said that it is a biography in stone. So all episodes in the life of Buddha, you could see that carved in stone. So the intangible, when it comes to studying, from the point of view of history, the intangible is becoming tangible. All the stories surrounding Buddha or all those events surrounding or ascriptions surrounding Buddha are acquiring a tangible form, in the sculptural form. Now, as a student of history, what makes Bodh Gaya particularly striking to me is that, whereas at all the other sites, you are celebrating these episodes in the life of Buddha. At Bodh Gaya, I was very, very, struck to see that all the parts of that episode are also have acquired a tangible form. So the story which goes in various forms at Bodh Gaya is that, he's come here, right? It was known by a different name earlier. He's come here, Buddha has come here to meditate. And he becomes weak, at which point of time Sujata gives him kheer, basically, different form of porridge or kheer or different. And then he regains, he strengthens himself, or revives himself, and then sits under a tree, a particular point in a tree, under a tree, right? And then what happens is that, there is an army which is sent by Mara. Mara sends an army and his daughters as well to disturb him. And then he takes this Bhumi Sparsh asana, basically, which is seen in this thing. Now, interesting bit is, and when after the enlightenment, what he does is, he spends his time, this next 7 weeks around Bodh Gaya. So that is this episode. So as opposed to any other site, where primary events in the life of Buddha are depicted in stone or whatever form, Bodh Gaya is particularly striking for the for the fact that all these important events that become a part of this enlightenment episode are also, here in tangible form, either at the site or around or in different geographies as well, right? So for example, birth of Buddha could be denoted in a particular way, but the events surrounding the birth of Buddha are not denoted everywhere in so much detail. But when it comes to Bodh Gaya, you have something like Sujata's stupa is there, right? Which dates to, according to the archaeological evidence, the earliest level dates to 1st century BC, right? And there is an inscription by Palas which says that it belongs to the 9th century. So there's a firm inscription there. About Mara, I was, taking a stroll yesterday with Sudhirendra ji, and I noticed that, on the outer wall, they have depicted the Mara's episode. So that has become very tangible. The seat where Buddha sat, Vajrasana, that has become very tangible. The tree, of course, is very tangible. And then, of the 7 monuments of the 7 weeks, so if you enter the temple, you see monuments of 7 weeks as you take this circumambulation. These have become tangible. So all the small episodes in the life of Buddha have become tangible, either at the site or beyond. So Sujata's thing you would also see in the frescoes in Horinji or Nihonji temple at Sarnath. You would also see Mara's episode in Ajanta, in the depictions at Ajanta or at Sanchi. You'd see the true tree and the stupa monumentalized and depicted in sculptural forms in the Bharut and Sanchi inscriptions, sculptural panels. So Bharut belongs to the 2nd century BC and Sanchi the 1st century BD. So this intangible and tangible balance is very important for understanding, when you get into this dialogue between history and faith. The second part, my second window is this relationship between the part and the whole. Now, what do I mean by that? The part or the whole is the Mahabodhi temple complex. But Mahabodhi temple complex is made up of different structures within the complex, right? Just as I said, there is a Bodhi tree, there is a railing, there is a Vajrasan, there is a temple complex, then there are monuments of 7 weeks, there are mathas, there are structures which are built by Mahants, basically. So that's a big one, basically. So this part and the whole, what is interesting is this relationship between these individual structures and Mahabodhi temple complex and how they pan out across time and space is also very important. And both the individual structures and the temple complex are changing over a period of time. They are acquiring new forms, they are acquiring new meanings. There's no fixed meaning, they are changing. And I'm saying this through the lens of built heritage or tangible heritage. That's where my talk is positioning, basically, right? And how this relationship evolves helps us understand how Buddhism unfolds itself at Bodh Gaya. Right? So let me talk about the first part. We have talked about, let's talk about the tree itself, which has become very iconic, right? Now, all those who you have read about tree know that it was destroyed, multiple times in the past, certainly during Ashoka's, Shashanka's time, right? And then when the British came, as Buchanan Hamilton states, that it was in a very ruined state, Now, according to an earlier tradition, Ashoka has sent his daughter with the tree to Sri Lanka, right? And in the earliest version of the tree, as they say, that it was received by the king at Anuradhapura, and that is known as the southern branch of the Bodhi tree. So the tree has cast its net very, very wide, spreading right up to Sri Lanka, right? And then when the colonial rulers come here, what they do is that the tree had disintegrated, right? So what they do is, take out seeds from an old tree which was nearby, they planted it. And what you see now is a tree which was planted during Cunningham's time. So the tree has, of course, changed its meaning. It has remained in the same locale more or less, but the tree has changed its meaning. Now, what happens to the seat there, the seat under which Buddha attained his enlightenment, the specific spot under which he sat and attained his enlightenment, which is now known as Vajrasana or the thunderbolt. Now that seat, when Ashoka comes here, basically in the 3rd century BC, he's attributed with the construction of that seat, basically. Right? So the sandstone thing comes up with some Mauryan symbols at place, and it changes during Kushana times, basically, or particularly shown in Huvisca's coins. So the seat has gone. But what is important is that the first set of representations that you see of Bodh Gaya elsewhere, right, which is in Bharut or Sanchi sculptures at Bharut and Sanchi, sees it as some kind of a tree shrine. So the tree is being shown, if you look at the sculptures at Sanchi, the tree is being shown, most probably a pillar was there. And that is how it's being depicted at Sanchi and at Bharut, basically. Now, there is a second stage which comes in. So the Vajrasana has been made under the tree. The second thing comes up is the railing around the tree, railing around the seat and the tree. And this railing is normally, there is an inscription there which records it as a kind of a donation by a queen called Kurangi. This queen is the queen of Agnimitra, who was believed to be a feudatory of Shungas, basically. So there are different dynasties which are, basically ruling that. So under the Sunga period, the idea of circumambulation, trying to define a circumambulation path is coming into place. So the shrine, the tree shrine, is now evolving, right? And what is being done is that, from the tree shrine, it is acquiring the form of an open pillared enclosure. So a small tree shrine, which is just appearing as a tree, is now taking the form of an enclosed open shrine, basically, which is, so the next set of depictions are about open pillared enclosure. And this railing also does not remain constant. So around 5th, 6th centuries, CE or AD, as you would call it earlier, this is enlarged. This railing is enlarged. And what you see here is basically difference in construction material, difference in decorative material in the railing. The original railing is not what you see under the tree. The railing has been kept in the museum, and what you see there is a replica of the actual railing there, right? And this railing also has many iconographic depictions. Besides episodes that from the life of Buddha, what you also see is that, yakshas and yakshis also featuring in. There is also a kind of a male deity that is shown with a trident, but people normally say that it is basically a male figure of the Shiva. And then there are Indira and Surya, who also occupy, in the Buddhist faith. Certainly Indira occupies an important position in the Buddhist faith. They are all being depicted there, right? So from here, so the second part is there, and then somewhere around 5th, 6th century CE, there is this pillar, the brick temple starts taking shape. So there are debates about it, when this brick temple, which is, around that, comes into place. And there is one plaque which has been found from Kumrar near Patna, in the outskirts of Patna, which is the earliest depiction of the brick temple, the Mahabodhi temple. So people say that, and this is dated to 2nd, 3rd centuries BC, so people say that somewhere around the Kushana time, the brick temple had started taking shape. But it is more towards 5th and 6th that it acquired some kind of a form. Now, what has happened in this process? We said that the first phase, it was tree shrine which was being worshipped. Then there is a circumambulation around it, which means an open pillared enclosure that is being worshipped. And now is coming the third stage, when a temple has been built. Right? So the focus with now comes is basically, the focus is now shifting from the tree to the seat, Vajrasana. Right? These are important meanings, so that the focus is shifting from there, because the temple has been erected there, basically. Now, over a period of time, what happens is 8th, 9th centuries, or 9th to 11th centuries to be more precise, the Palas are ruling modern day Bihar and Bengal. And the Palas, under the Palas, there is a lot of production of stone images. So a lot of statues are being built. So, and many of these statues that were built during Pala times, so when you see the brick tower, there are windows there where, images of, deities are kept, Buddhas or Bodhisattvas are kept, So this happens during, the Pala time. But a lot of other statues are also being built. Some of also of Shiva, of Parvati, Uma Maheshwara, or the Shiva family, or Buddhas there. Some of these could be found in Calcutta, museum, some, the site museum. Some of them are found elsewhere as well, and some were found in Mahan's compound as well. So it's a whole composite, set of images which are being produced around that time, right? And then, around 16th century, the Mahants come in. And they give and the structures, start acquiring the form of the Mahants, basically the Gaya Mahants. But what is also important is, according to at least two texts, there are many texts which mention that. One is Gaya Mahamatya, which is 8th to 9th century, and one is Tirth Chintamani, which is 13th century. This place was being seen as important for shraddhas and funerary rites, basically, right? So it is acquiring a complex form. And then comes the 19th century period when, what happens is that, this whole structure was reconstructed. I'll talk about that later. So the present structure that you see was built during colonial times. But one other important part that I should tell you about is the monuments of the 7 weeks. These are 7 monuments. So as you go inside the temple complex, as you descend the first set of steps, there is a pillar and there is the first monument. So the idea is there that Buddha spent the first, after gaining enlightenment, he spent the first 7 weeks around the tree, trying to internalize that knowledge. So at different points, there are, so first week, second week, third week, fourth week, fifth week. Now, there are debates about the sequence of these monuments, right? The orderly sequence, which monument comes. So different people say this, basically. But this is an old concept about these monuments. And this is, basically a thing which happens, this has been mentioned by Huinsang. This has been mentioned by, the Mahabodhi accounts. This is mentioned by Cunningham. And this is being mentioned by Burma Theravada, in Burmese Theravada accounts, basically. But what is there is that in all the pre-1989 accounts, and I'll tell you something which happened in pre-1989, which changed the whole set of things in this thing. Pre-1989, there is a difference in terms of the last 3 monuments of the last 3 weeks. Where did Buddha spend the last 3 of the 7 weeks? Right? And some say that it is yet to be ascertained, or some say that it was found outside of the complex, basically, right? Even those by, Thai or Sihalis monks, concur with this, found with these 2 last things, Now, the exact location and orderly sequence is something which is a subject to debate. But what happens is 1989 is that a monk finds one of those, temple officials trying to remove a pillar, and that results into a strike, which is being led by the Burmese monks, but they are joined by the other monastic establishments later elsewhere. And what happens is that, because in order to avoid any future confusion, there is, a person who is deputed there, and a committee, a set of people who are deputed there, and they fix the exact location and order of the monument of the first 7 weeks based on a text which is known as Jinnatha Prakashan, which was written in 1920 by a Burmese monk, Kaithi Laitop Sahdev. So based on that account, these 7, the order and the exact location are fixed, basically. Now, what this process does, and how does a historian is concerned about is, because what you have done is, there are multivocal narratives. So you have put and imposed a masterly narrative over the multivocal narratives. As I said, there were debates and discussions about the exact location and the orderly sequence of the movements of the 7 weeks. So that is being set into place. Now, what happens is that thereafter, my third frame or my third window through this heritage framework that I am adopting is about pilgrims, travelers, and monks. I find the site of Bodh Gaya as one of the sites which is inviting a huge amount of movement. tremendously mobile region, people coming here, going out, so that kind of, particularly coming here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the earliest record of a pilgrimage is under Ashoka, right, which is the 3rd century BC. Ashoka comes here as a part of the pilgrimage and as a part of that old Buddhist saying, which said that at least visit these 4 places of mine, where I'm born, where I attain enlightenment, where I delivered my first sermon, and where I die. Ashoka comes here. And what he's trying to do is he's marked the places. So as I said, he marked the Vajrasana, the seat there, constructed a seat there for the benefit of the pilgrims. But what you say is that, what you see is that already an inscriptional evidence refers to a settlement of Sinhalese monks, basically, or people from Sri Lanka, or monks who had come from Sri Lanka as early as 6th century BC. And there is an inscription of a person called Mahanama who says that, he constructed a mansion for the teacher. So 6th century so 3rd century is in a domestic, what you would in modern terms call domestic tourism. But in the 6th century, you have, foreign tourism, the earliest version of this thing, who is already settled there. So may have, these are by records. So there is possibility that people may have come there earlier as well, right? And from, roughly from 5th, 6th century to around 13th century, 14th century, there is a whole lot of people who are coming here. People, monks, travelers, and pilgrims from different countries. From China, from Tibet, from Sri Lanka, from Burma, all these people are coming there. Right? Now, as far as the Chinese travelers are concerned, but I must tell you before I get into the details, during those times, travel was not something you could do on your own. And if you go out without a permission of the emperor, then you could be punished for it as well. Right? Now, despite this is getting a lot of things. Now, let me tell you some of the specificities of the Chinese, monks or travelers. So somewhere between, there are basically 2 phases in that, The first phase is between 5th to 8th centuries. And between 5th to 8th centuries, many of those people come here basically. Now, two very famous, the Fahian and, Wensang. But there were others also who came here. One, very Wan Zhuans is one who came here in 7th century with the imperial support, But there are many travelers who are coming, right? Now, these travelers, what they're doing is they are leaving accounts or they are leaving behind inscriptions, both of which are very, very important, right? Now, the first phase of Chinese travel, as I said, is between 5th to 8th century BC. There is a discontinuity in 9th century, but from 10th to 13th century, there is again a resumption, possibly ascribed to the fall of the Tang dynasty in 9th century. And from 9th to 13th century, as you say, there is a resumption of 10th to 13th century, there is a resumption of Chinese travel, possibly under the reunified Song dynasty. Now, there are certain things which are very peculiar to this period of, 10th to 13th centuries, Chinese travelers or Chinese monks. So more monks are coming, right? And more monks are coming with imperial support, with the favor of the emperor. The emperor is asking them, or they're coming with their permissions, there. According to one estimates, before 1035, around 183 monks had returned with scriptures, returned from India to China with scriptures, right? And many of them have been leaving behind stone scriptures. Now, what is the purpose of this traveling, right? The purpose of, one of those official purposes was, basically the collection of Buddhist scriptures, and so that, they can help arrive at, consolidate the Buddhist law. But in the process of their doing that, one is the whole idea about merit that you seek, basically. So merit either for yourselves or for the emperor, right? So you're also bolstering emperor's prestige when you travel, basically, and the whole idea of transference of merit. But what you are also doing is, when you go back, you're taking, back some sacred relics, Chintamani pearls, which is a kind of a wish-fulfilling pearls that, you see there basically. Leaves from Buddhistry, and also scriptures, as I said, about that, basically. Likewise, Burmese monks, they have been coming, and there is evidence of their repairs of Burmese monks from 11th and 13th centuries, 14th centuries. They are being coming missions which are coming who are repairing the site. So the site or the Mahabodhi complex is falling into disrepair, and somebody is repairing them, right? And this is, as David Gary says, this is connection, this is connected. These are all, with the support of the emperor. This is also connected with the idea of the Dham Rajas, or the righteous kings, basically, where, you acquire merit there, right? When you send them, you do that, but in the process, you also bolster your image there. And then you have, around 14th century, 15th century, Dhamma Swami, who comes from Tibet, whose account becomes a very important account for reconstruction of the history of Mahabodhi complex. Now, what is it in us for us that? What I did was gave you a set of things and analyze some trends within. Now, why these travelers or monks are important? A, that this is a movement of tremendous, a site for tremendous mobility. One of the sites which around this point of time is inviting tremendous mobility, perhaps the highest level of mobility, and a site which is not directly connected with trade. There was mobility, lot of mobility at sites which were directly connected with trade. But here is a pilgrimage site which is attending a lot of this thing. Now, the Mahabodhi temple complex and the area around has not been excavated very properly. So for the bulk of the times, these accounts become our primary sources, basically. They help us reconstruct the idea of the site in a big way. All this traveler's account. The second part is that, they leave behind inscriptions and accounts, basically, which I talked about. The third part of it is that, they carry back relics and ideas. So they are contributing to the dissemination of Buddhism and the spread of Buddhism. The monks played a very important role in the spread of the Buddhism. Right? So they're carrying back ideas. So the idea of Bodh Gaya is now getting across other countries, other continents as well. Right? So the idea is becoming globalized. This is the first phase of globalization of the ideas. And then I come to my fourth window of that heritage frame. And the fourth window is that of replicas and representations. So what is happening is around 10th and 11th century, there are a lot of replicas of the temples which is being made, basically. Lot of replicas. There is a huge amount of production of art around the Bodh Gaya temple, right? And a lot of art has to do with, and there are different forms in which it manifests, basically. So there are many stone engravings, basically, stone carvings of the Mahabodhi temple, right? Which can be seen either in the form of seals, particularly seals which have a verse which calls Ye Dharma. Ye Dharma is connected to a philosophy which is called the chain of dependent origination, which is said that Buddha fulfilled that, that talk about that philosophy here, basically. Then you see clay tablets, you see 3D stone carvings, which have been found in various museums across the world. So Cleveland Museum, Metropolitan Museum of Art, or Cleveland Museum, talks about that. But they have also been found and carried away during this, 11th and 12th century to Burma and Tibet. So a lot of art objects are stone engraving, stone carvings of temple, either as clay tablets or as 3D miniatures, which are being produced and carried away, of course, to Tibet and Burma, but many other places. So the replica is going elsewhere. The replica of the temple has started traveling, basically, right? What you also see is metal models, such as one found in, and this is, Jaipur Garh in 1976. So there are metal, carvings as well. Then there are wooden carvings and paintings, basically, which have been found in Tibet around this time. So this is around 8th to 12th century. So a lot of artistic production is happening, as I said. But one of the most important thing, and I want your attention on this, I thought it was more, it's 47. We began at 10:15. But what is happening is that, the most important thing that is happening is large-scale replicas or temples or Mahabodhi temples, exact replicas, are being made in places like Myanmar, China, Thailand, and Nepal. Right? So between 12th to 15th centuries, these replicas, these temples are being made in different countries. Right? And how do you see those temples? And how do you see? So between 12th and century, as I said, in Burma, in Thailand, in Nepal, in China, later in Mongolia, the Mahabodhi temple, if you go to those places, you see the Mahabodhi temple, exact replicas of the big replicas of this temple. Now, what it is showing there? The idea is that this is the time when Mahabodhi temple complex started disaggregating because of unstable times around the monuments. Right? So the traveling is becoming unsafe. So people are taking the replica based on the replicas carried by monks and travelers. They are re-erecting those things in their own places. So temples are coming into being. The other part is, according to the Tibet tradition, is about basically how you see and imagine a site basically. So these replicas are also fulfilling that logic. But from the point of view of the kings and the emperors, the idea of reenacting and relocating a site to their own capital brings a lot of merit themselves as well. So it is serving a multi-layered purpose. But what is doing that is the traveling destinations are moving to some other place. So there is a replica being produced. And what you're saying is that moving or resettling the sacred Saint Mahabodhi temples in the other countries as well. And then comes, basically, then I come to my fifth frame, which is the frame about the 19th century, where new actors enter the scene. And new actors enter the scene where I'm talking about the colonial apparatus, but I'm also talking about ideas which are emerging into the West, ideas, practices, or intellectual discourses, which are emerging into the West. Right? And they're marking a presence in Bodh Gaya or this site as well. How they impact the built heritage and its imagination and its positioning. So the first set of things which start happening here is that, 19th century, there is the first set of discovery, rediscovery, and remaking of Bodh Gaya starts in the 19th century. You must have heard about this stream called Romanticism in the West, basically. So one of those aspects of it manifests in different forms in literature, in search for ruins also. So one of those strands of which is search of ruins, So there are a set of travelers who are coming from West, basically, who are in search of ruins. And then they are drawing paintings or lithographs. So William and Thomas Daniel, you may have heard about, or Charles O'Dowley, he's producing lithographs around that. So the first set of reproductions or drawings or paintings are happening because of the European, this whole thing about search for ruins and Romanticism. But middle of 19th century is also a time when archaeology is coming up as a standard discipline in the West. And the colonial apparatus was very clever to package archaeology in this discourse of Orientalist framework. What did Orientalist framework said? That there is a difference between how East and how West is, broadly. And then says that you should know the subjects better in order to rule them better. And when archaeology comes in as a discipline, they say that, look, we have found a discipline that will systematically or do a scientific study of the past. By extension, that we will do a scientific study of true Buddha, true Buddhism, true Buddhist heritage. And what they were doing is they are carefully garbing them in the civilization mission. That we are civilizing you. We are recovering your ruins. We are recovering your monuments for you, for your benefit. So the colonial discourse is very carefully garbed. And what happens is that around that time, a Burmese delegation is here to do some repairs, and they enter into an altercation with the Mahans settled there. And the colonial rulers interfere and eventually end up, removing the Burmese and rebuilding the temple themselves. Right? In the process of rebuilding the temple, they used a 12th century replicas. Remember I talked about replicas up in the last section. So they used a 12th century replica. They saw, this is how the temple looks like. So they started putting it there and put up a new a kind of a complete rebuild the temple structure. Now, in the process of doing that, what they did with the sculptures over there, what they did with the statues over there, what they did with the reliefs over there, is something which is something to ponder upon and seriously ponder upon. But the modern top structures, the four corner towers on the thing, and the facade, this is all which was done under the colonial rule. Right? So what the colonial rule is doing is, in essence, and this is something which is important for you to know, is because it is treating something which is a religious, a sacred monument as a historical and a archaeological monument. Right? So it is carrying out this restoration exercise as an archaeological exercise. Right? Now the conversation methods differ where you have questions of faith involved or a sacred monument complexes involved. But what you do is based on your preferences and based off your reading of multiple renovations in the past, you choose one renovation and rebuild the whole thing on based on one renovation that you were familiar with, or you choose to opt for. There is a third strand to the ideas emerging in the West as well during that time, and which is the strand which is an intellectual discourse which is on world religions, 19th century. So this world religions discourse says that all the religions have their sacred spaces. Now, interestingly, they are trying to, figure out Buddhist equivalent to Muslims' Mecca or Christians' Jerusalem. And Bodh Gaya becomes a part of it. The site of enlightenment, considered the most important, becomes a part of it. So this intellectual discourse, so Bodh Gaya becomes a part of it. And one of those very famous, proponents of this, thing was a person who was very famous person, Edwin Arnold. He had wrote a very famous book called The Light of Asia, where he supported this idea. And Dharmapala Anagarika, who is the Sri Lankan monk who comes here basically and forms the Mahabodhi Society, was partly influenced by him as by the Theosophist. So when, Dharmapala Anagarika comes, he is basically, taking about that dialogue, but also internationalizing it by the formation of the Mahabodhi Society. So the whole ideas that I'm talking about, various frames or various windows that I'm talking about, each is contributing to the spread of Mahabodhi temple or the idea of Mahabodhi temple in different parts of the world. And when finally it results in a set of legal battles, and when in 1953 the Bodh Gaya Temple Management Committee was there, so it reversed the decision earlier, it reversed the initiative which was earlier taken by the colonial rulers, which is the colonial rulers restored it as an archaeological monument. So 1953, whatever things the Temple Management Committee forms, so it reinforces or changes the position as an archaeology object to a sacred object once again. And then I come to the sixth frame, which is independence and beyond. So there is a lot of discussion which is happening around the independence time that India is becoming independent. What will be the national iconography? So there are debates and discussions, and these debates and discussions saw the return of Buddha and Ashoka in this debate. And one of the things, so Ashoka becomes a very important icon, and the Sarnath lion pillar capital that you have seen with the Dharma Chakra wheel becomes the national emblem. But what also makes a big comeback in this new debates and discussions is Bodh Gaya itself. The seat of enlightenment is now being used by the first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru as an important diplomacy tool. So what he is trying to do is that, he is trying to use that as a tool to build diplomatic relations with newly independent nations that have come in Asia, basically, who have recently become independent. And in the process, also try and bolster, the image of India in a post-colonial world order. So he uses Bodh Gaya as a very important site, and many of earlier, speakers have talked about, in 1956, there is a 2500th anniversary of the Mahaparinirvana, where lots of people, attend that, And 1956 itself, you see the Bodh Gaya Temple Advisory Board was made. That was another important decision which was made in 1956, which had representations from people from other countries. So when I'm talking about this section, I have now moved on that section from where historian and the faith are talking to themselves. I am now moving on from a dialogue to a more complex multi-log where lots of other players have come into being. The politics of a new nation state has come into being, right? And then what is happening around now will also come into play the local role of administrators, the town planners, the builders, all those things, the tourism management, these will become very important in this phase, basically. Right? So here the present is talking to the past and how the present is invoking the past to build a present. Right? So what you do is, the Bodh Gaya Temple Advisory Board, arrives at, land allotments for monasteries, guest houses, and do that. And what you see is that, there are a lot of, structures or establishments which were being built, basically from Asian countries, including Burma, Thailand, Tibet, China, Vietnam, Korea, Japan, Sri Lanka. Bodh Gaya also becomes a very important part of the Tibet's exile geography. So after exile, Bodh Gaya has become a very important part of the Tibet, basically. And there is a lot of buildings which start coming up, basically. Right? Now, there is a very important difference between these buildings and monasteries that are coming up and one that I talked about between 11th to 13th century. Is that when these Buddhist monastic establishments are coming into place, they are different. They are building their own national architectural styles. As opposed to the earlier phase, when I talked about 13th, 15th century, they were building the monastic establishment as an exact replica of Mahabodhi temple. Right? So now when you have the new monastic establishments, what they're building is based on the natural architectural styles. So if you have the Royal Wat Tha, it is remodeled after the marble temple in Bangkok, basically. And then so the whole space is being resettled. So how the present is, based on a certain specific meanings of the past, is resettling that space. There's a new rebuilding exercise into place, and there are all other things come into place. So public rituals, statues, like the giant Buddha, which is built, which is the Japanese collaboration. Then you have public rituals like the Kal Chakra. So very, very interesting elements from the point of view of ethnography or cultural anthropology. There are many people coming into place. There's a resettling. It's being called as a mini Asia. There are with establishments come people. So lot people. There are people who are settling down. There are people who are starting local businesses. So the land use is getting changed. The urban patterns start getting changed as well. Right? So this is what is happening, and what is said in scholarly terms that Bodh Gaya is becoming globalized. So Buddhism has found its world religion, as they say, in Bodh Gaya. And with that, I think I'll stick to your time that Gunjani gave me. So another 2 minutes, and I'll say that. And my seventh frame is, I'm done, basically. So the seventh frame is about the World Heritage Site, the declaration of the World Heritage Site, which is in 2002, 2003. It happens around the same time when the Bodh Gaya International Airport is being built. Now, what this site does is basically, what the World Heritage Site status does is basically, it privileges the Buddhist understanding of the site, basically putting other things. So Ashoka and Buddha become very important in the World Heritage Site descriptions, basically. Right? So I could see there were some factual errors in this description of the World Heritage Site status, especially with regard to the railing and things like that, or also with the monuments of the first 7 weeks. Right? So what is happening is that, lot of tourists are again coming. So World Heritage Site means, basically that the UNESCO has also come into being as a new player in that. And when the World Heritage Site status comes into place, they ask for a certain redevelopment of Bodh Gaya. That look, this is now where it's going to go. So this is a core, you need to have a kind of a buffer state. So a lot of urban exercises are currently going on about what form will it take. Something that we were also talking about in the breakfast table today in the morning is what form will it take? What kind of land use, what kind of urban settlements? So there's a lot of debate which is going on there. What will be the relationship of Bodh Gaya with Gaya, basically, or the Hindu pilgrimage center of Bodh Gaya vis-a-vis the Buddhist pilgrimage center? These are the things which will pan out, how this relationship between the buffer zone and the core pans out is what will now augur in for the next meaning of Bodh Gaya. Thank you. That's where I'm at.
Thank you so much, sir, for that very enlightening and very interesting talk, and for very beautifully curating those 7 windows for us, out of which definitely the first one is of my interest, and I would love to talk to you about the same. Now we would like to open the floor for some questions. Do we have some questions for the speaker?
हेलो, 2 दिनों से सुन रहा हूँ, बोलने का मौका नहीं मिल रहा था। आज मौका देने के लिए पहले धन्यवाद दे देता हूँ आपको। ये टॉपिक था बोध गया एंड बियॉन्ड द लार्जर जियो कल्चरल कनेक्शन एंड हिस्ट्रीज। तो हिस्ट्री पर हमारा स्पीकर ज़्यादा चले गए, जियो कल्चरल कनेक्शन कहीं टूट गया। तो मैं उड़ीसा से आया हूँ, उड़ीसा के बारे में बोलना चाहता हूँ। एक बार भी कलिंग के बारे में नहीं बोला, और जहाँ कैसे हुआ ये बुद्धिस्ट और बुद्धिज्म के अलावा तो हम सोच नहीं सकते। और हमको ढूंढना है बुद्धिज्म का कनेक्शन कहाँ कहाँ है, रूट्स कहाँ कहाँ है, और इसको कैसे एक नेटवर्क बनाया जाए। और नेटवर्क बोध गया विल बी द क्वीन ऑफ दैट नेटवर्क एंड टूरिज्म नेटवर्क, राइट। ये नहीं हुआ। और जो श्रीलंका में जो बुद्धिज्म गया, या साउथ एशिया में जो गया, साउथ ईस्ट एशिया में, वो कैसे गया? सी रूट में कलिंग होकर। कलिंग के बारे में कुछ नहीं बताया, और मैं ज़्यादा नहीं बोलूँगा। और ये कनेक्शन रहना चाहिए। अगर हम नहीं होते तो हमको पता, किसको पता भी नहीं चलता है कि कैसे छोड़ देते हैं कलिंगा को, यानी ओडिशा को। धन्यवाद।
आपके सवाल के लिए बहुत धन्यवाद आपको, लेकिन आपको ये समझना होगा कि जब भी सेमिनार में एक पेपर होता है तो उसका एक फोकस होता है। उसमें मैं सब कुछ कवर नहीं कर सकता, लेकिन अगर मैं नहीं कवर कर रहा हूं तो मेरा पर्पस या अभिप्राय कभी भी इसको छोड़ने का नहीं है या उसका अनादर करने का नहीं है। एक सेमिनार का एक फोकस होता है, एक टॉक का एक फोकस होता है। आप उसके बियॉन्ड नहीं बात कर सकते हैं। मेरा फोकस था महाबोधि टेम्पल कॉम्प्लेक्स का मतलब कैसे वो आइडिया जो है एक ग्लोबल कल्चरल कनेक्शंस दिखते हैं। लेकिन जब आपने एक सवाल पूछा है, और मैं उसके कॉन्टेक्स्ट में बता सकता हूँ, एक जो है ये जो ओडिशा का जो कनेक्शन मैं बता सकता हूँ। एक अभी आप जाएंगे तो जो मैंने बताया कि जब मॉन्यूमेंट्स ऑफ 7 वीक्स हैं, है ना, वो मॉन्यूमेंट ऑफ 7 वीक्स में एक जो 7th वीक का मॉन्यूमेंट है जिसको राजयत्न ट्री कहते हैं, वो लास्ट वाला जो वीक है, बुद्धा ने वहां पर 7th वीक कहा करने के लिए, है ना। और उसमें वहां पर ये स्टोरी ये है कि बुद्धा जो है वो कॉन्टेम्पलेशन में थे, और जब वो उठे तो उनको राइस केक्स और हनी खिलाया गया। 2 लोगों के द्वारा, 2 मर्चेंट्स के द्वारा खिलाया गया। जो एक डोमिनेंट ट्रेडिशन है, एक परंपरा, वो ये कहती है कि 2 लोग थे, तपुस्सा और भल्लिका, जो कि उत्कल से थे, तो जिन्होंने उसको खिलाया करके वहां पे करने के लिए। लेकिन इसके अलावा, और ये कहानी इंपॉर्टेंट इसलिए है क्योंकि कैसे आप एक कहानी को कई तरीके से ले जाते हैं दूसरे तरीके के लिए। उसका दूसरा जो है वो है उसका म्यांमारीज कनेक्शन। वहां पर वो कनेक्शन ये कहता है कि ये जो 2 मर्चेंट्स थे, उनको बुद्धा ने अपने बाल का एक टुकड़ा दिया ये खाने के बाद, और ये टुकड़ा लेके वो चले गए। और वहां पर एक स्वेडागन पैगोडा है जहां अभी भी ये रिलिक्स के रूप में अभी एस्टैब्लिश है। तो कैसे इनटेंजिबल जो है वो टेंजिबल बनते चला जाता है, वो कहानियां जो है नए मीनिंग्स एक्वायर कर रही होती है। तो पार्ट्स ऑफ द, लेकिन जो मैं बता रहा था कि मेरा अभिप्राय इस भाषण में वो नहीं, बारे में मेरा आइडिया था कि बोध गया कि कैसे ग्लोबल कल्चरल करके करो, कैसे ट्रैवल कर रहा है, वो सब चीजें मैं बात कर सकता हूं, बट ये इस सेमिनार के बियॉन्ड के टॉपिक के जो मैं बात कर रहा हूं उसके बाहर में। बट मेरा किसी भी तरीके से अगर मैं वो छोड़ता हूं तो वो एक समय की भी सीमा होती है और एक टॉपिक होता है। समय से ज्यादा टॉपिक किस पर आप बोल रहे हैं। तो उस पे उसके लिए करना। बट एक स्टोरी जो महाबोधि से कनेक्टेड है वो मैंने आपको बताया, बट कई ऐसे स्टोरीज हैं उड़ीसा, और उड़ीसा तो बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट सेंटर है बुद्धिस्ट लैंडस्केप का, बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट सेंटर है। बट आप एक सीमित समय में और एक सीमित टॉपिक के साथ कुछ ही बातें बोल सकते हैं, सब तो नहीं बोल सकते। आप भी कहीं अगर आप उड़ीसा के बारे में अगर आप बोल रहे हो कहीं पे, मैं बोलूं कि आपने तो बताया नहीं कि भाई वो कोरिया में कैसे फैला बुद्धिज्म, तो ये वो वाली बात हो जाएगी। तो इसलिए हम उस किसी तरीके से हम उसका अनादर नहीं करते हैं या किसी भी तरीके से उसको बाईपास नहीं कर रहे हैं, बट समय सीमा और टॉपिक की परिधि के तहत में इसमें करें।
सर मेरा क्वेश्चन है आपसे, आपने बहुत अच्छा मैंने प्रेजेंटेशन तो बहुत अच्छा था सर, डेफिनेटली 7 विंडोज, बट आज मैं सर क्वेश्चन ये है आपसे कि जो टेंजिबल फॉर्म था 300 BC से 880 AD तक पूरे वेस्टर्न कंट्रीज में डेवलप्ड हुआ, जैसे भी इंटेंजिबल फॉर्म को टेंजिबल में कन्वर्टेड करते हुए पूरे वियतनाम, चाइनीज, कोरिया, बट व्हाट वाज रीजंस और देयर वर व्हाट वाज कॉजेज this tangible form not evolved to the in a western part of the India. Second question है कि after 1947 after independent इंडिया की जो गवर्नमेंट है या पॉलिसीज है ऑन द बुद्धास पे, एक तो 2002 में है कि जब से वर्ल्ड हेरिटेज घोषित किया गया, उसके बाद से 47 से लेके अभी तक क्या डेवलपमेंट कर रही है गवर्नमेंट, इधर सेंट्रल और स्टेट गवर्नमेंट ऑन द बुद्धा टू स्प्रेड द बुद्धा फिलोसफी? या सर ये मेरा 2 क्वेश्चन है।
आपके पहले सवाल का जवाब जो टेंजिबल इनटेंजिबल टू टेंजिबल का मैंने मेरे ख्याल से दिया, लेकिन मैं उसका एग्जाम्पल्स के जरिए और बताता हूँ, स्पेसिफिक एग्जाम्पल्स के लिए बताता हूँ। मैं ये प्रेमाइज कर रहा था अपने पहले विंडो में कि जब हम एक डायलेमा होता है, एक हिस्टोरियन होता है, उसको एक सर्टेन तरीके से हिस्ट्री के बारे में पढ़ाया जाता है, तो वो डायलॉग करता है, वो एक वार्तालाप करता है अपने सब्जेक्ट के साथ में, एक फेथ के साथ में। बोध गया में एक फेथ है और क्वेश्चन ऑफ फेथ इज इन्वॉल्व। तो कैसे वो देखता है, जब वो देखता है, और हिस्टोरियन के लिए एक बड़ी इंपॉर्टेंट चीज हो जाती है कि सोर्स बेस क्या है आपका, चाहे वो टेक्सचुअल एविडेंस है या आर्कियोलॉजिकल एविडेंस है ना। और बहुत सारे ऐसे आपको मतलब चूंकि आप मतलब पढ़े होंगे कहीं ना कहीं, बट मैं उसको दोहरा देता हूँ। बुद्धा के मृत्यु के कई 100 साल के बाद में जो ये सब टेक्सचुअल ट्रेडिशंस भी बनने शुरू होते हैं, राइट। और जब टेक्सचुअल ट्रेडिशंस बनते हैं तो पहला जो होता है उसमें कि क्या बुद्धिस्ट लॉ, क्या बुद्धिस्ट टीचिंग्स होती थी, पहला फोकस उस पर होता है। तो वो कोडिफाई होना शुरू हो जाता है जब ये बुद्धिस्ट काउंसिल्स आने शुरू होते हैं। जब पहले सेटअप की बुद्धा चले गए, अब हमको ऑर्डर को कैसे चलाना है, संघ को कैसे चलाना है, तब रूल्स, और वो मरने के कई 100 साल बाद आ रहे हैं वो करने के लिए। तो आप फर्स्ट सेट ऑफ दिस थिंग कर रहे हैं। अब क्या हो रहा है कि बेस्ड ऑन दैट लोगों को ये लग रहा है कि यार ये सब बातें तो हुई हैं, तो क्यों नहीं हम ऐसे मॉन्यूमेंट्स, कुछ इमारत, कुछ ऐसे बना देते हैं। और उस सिलसिले में एक बात जो मैं बोल रहा था, जो कि मुझे बोध गया में खास करके इंपॉर्टेंट दिखती हैं एज कंपेयर टू अदर साइट्स, कि अदर साइट्स में बुद्धा के जो प्रमुख इवेंट हैं, बर्थ है, इनलाइटनमेंट है, फर्स्ट सरमन है सारनाथ, या डेथ है कुशीनगर में, ये सब चीज़ों पे जोर है। कुछ लोग इसको 8 इवेंट भी मानते हैं कि भाई बुद्ध का जन्म हुआ, बुद्ध छोड़ के गए सब कुछ करने के लिए, उसके बाद एनलाइटनमेंट हुआ, उसके बाद वो एनलाइटनमेंट के बाद वो सारनाथ में जाते हैं। तो ऐसे कई लोग 8 इवेंट भी मानते हैं। ये दिखाई जाए बोध गया के केस में एक जो बात मुझे बहुत स्ट्राइकिंग लगी एज समबडी हु इज स्टडीइंग हेरिटेज, इसकी बोध गया में जो बात है एनलाइटनमेंट की, उस किस्से को पूरी तरीके से दर्शाया गया है, टैंजिबलाइज कर दिया गया है। तो चाहे वो सुजाता की बात हो, चाहे वो पेड़ की बात हो, चाहे वो वज्रासन की जहां वो बैठे उसकी बात हो, चाहे फिर वो जो पहला 6-7 सप्ताह वहां गुजारे, ये सारे चीज को टैंजिबल, या मारा का अटैक उसके पहले, या फिर इवन जो मैं 7 के बारे में, या फिर एक जो मुचिलिंदा करके जो नाग है वो आके उनको वो देता है, जब वो बात कर रहे तो शरण देता है। तो एक वहाँ आपने पॉन्ड देखा होगा कि वो एक पॉन्ड है, एक तालाब है वहाँ पे, जहाँ पर एक सांप का ऐसे स्ट्रक्चर है, बुद्धा उसके नीचे बैठे हुए हैं, तो वो उनको प्रोटेक्शन दे रहा है। ये पूरी बातें जो बोध गया में हुई, उसको आप मॉन्यूमेंट्स के रूप में या आर्टिफैक्ट्स के रूप में देख सकते हो वहाँ पे करने के लिए। ये बात रही बात कि आपको कि भाई पश्चिम भारत में आप बोल रहे थे, वेस्टर्न इंडिया में, या आप वेस्ट में बोल रहे हैं? हाँ, वेस्टर्न कंट्रीज में। वेस्ट जो है, पहले तो वेस्टर्न इंडिया में हुआ था, क्योंकि सांची और भरूच में मैंने बताया कि पूरा बायोग्राफी ही दिखाई देता है बुद्धिज्म को। वेस्ट जो पिक्चर में बहुत लेट आता है, 19वीं शताब्दी में, कई सौ साल बाद वेस्ट आ रहा है, मतलब 1200-1300 साल जब आप पीरियड जो क्वेश्चन आपने किया उसके बाद आ रहा है। और वेस्ट जो है वो एक एजेंडा के साथ में आ रहा है। वो एजेंडा है कॉलोनियलिज्म और डोमिनेशन। उसके अंदर कई स्टैंड्स, में ये नहीं कहूंगा कि एक ही एजेंडा है, बट पहला जो मैंने बताया कि एक रोमांटिसिज्म है कि रूइंस हैं, पुराने लोग तो आके पेंटिंग ड्राइंग बढ़िया बढ़िया बन रही है करके, ठीक है। लेकिन जब कॉलोनियल रूल यहाँ आता है तो उसका एक स्पेसिफिक एजेंडा है कि मुझे इनको कंट्रोल करना है, इस पॉपुलेशन को मुझे कंट्रोल करना है। तो जब आप एक स्पेसिफिक एजेंडा से काम करते हैं तो एक, और पहली दूसरी बात यह कि उनको भी समझ में नहीं आ रहा कि कैसे करें, इनको कैसे मैं हैंडल करूं। बोध गया एक ऐसी जगह जहां पे इतने सारी चीजें मैं कैसे हैंडल करूं, लेकिन उनके पास क्या था कि उन्होंने अपने आइडियाज को लाके यहाँ इंप्लीमेंट किए। उन्होंने आर्कियोलॉजी की बात की।
हर्षवर्धन के काल तक इधर सारे फैल गए थे, ईस्ट कंट्री, वेस्ट कंट्रीज में से लेकर,
हाँ 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 हाँ। अच्छा, आप बुद्धिज्म के स्प्रेड को लेकर सवाल पूछ रहे हैं? अच्छा,
उसका मोनुमेंट जैसे कि टेंजिबल फॉर्म,
हाँ हाँ
कोई भी मंदिर, कोई भी
हाँ
सांची अदर्स कंट्रीज में नहीं मिलता है, जैसे यूरोपियन कंट्रीज।
अच्छा अच्छा हाँ अच्छा 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 अच्छा, नहीं वेस्ट में बोल रहे हैं, वो साउथ ईस्ट की तरफ तो हमने, हाँ ये जो 2 या 3 चीज़ों से बात फैल रही थी उस समय जो है, मतलब 7th 8th सेंचुरी, 9th 7th सेंचुरी से लेके 13th सेंचुरी तक जो स्प्रेड हो रहा है, वो स्प्रेड हो रहा है अलोंग द ट्रेड रूट्स। तो जो ट्रेड रूट्स इंडिया फॉलो कर रही है, या मूवमेंट ऑफ मॉन्क्स के बारे में, तो बुद्धिज्म का स्प्रेड हो रहा है। बहुत कम उधर गया है, मतलब गंधारा में, वेस्ट की अगर बात करें तो गंधारा अफगानिस्तान, मतलब जिसको आज हम वेस्ट के रूप में देख रहे हैं, तो एक रीच हो सकता है, ट्रांसपोर्टेशन का है, कम्युनिकेशन के मेथड्स है, उसके दौरान एक सर्टेन रीच हो सकता है। तो बहुत सारी चीज़ें जो कि उस समय पार्ट हो गई थी, जो कि आज के हिसाब से, मैं वेस्ट का मतलब उस समय उतना वेस्ट तक नहीं पहुँच पा रहे हम। पाकिस्तान हो गया, अफगानिस्तान हो गया, गंधार हो गया, ग्रीस तक जो है यहाँ तक स्प्रेड हो चुका है। तो स्तूपास वगैरह दिख रहे हैं या बुद्धिस्ट स्कल्पचर्स दिख रहे हैं, है ना। 2 बहुत फेमस स्कूल माने जाते हैं बुद्धा के स्कल्पचर्स का, एक गंधारा और एक मथुरा। तो स्प्रेड नॉर्थ वेस्ट हो रहा है, वेस्ट तक नहीं पहुंच पाया। जैसे जैसे कम्युनिकेशंस और डेवलपमेंट और इंटरैक्शंस बढ़ते हैं, वैसे वैसे बुद्धिज्म का बढ़ता है। और बहुत सिस्टमैटिक एंगेजमेंट 19th सेंचुरी के बाद ही हो रहा है। तो 19th सेंचुरी के बाद हो रहा है, वो भी एक टर्म्स एंड कंडीशंस के साथ हो रहा है कि हम इस वांटेज पॉइंट के साथ में यहाँ पे आ रहे हैं करने के लिए। तो अभी स्तूप मिलने लगे आपको, जब वो बढ़ने लगा तब स्तूप आपको मिलने लगे करके, वेस्ट में भी अब स्तूप मिलने लगे। लेकिन उस समय स्प्रेड कर रहा है आइदर अलोंग द ट्रेड रूट्स और अलोंग द रूट्स ऑफ द मॉन्क्स। तो मैंने बताया जहाँ जहाँ मॉन्क्स आ रहे हैं और जहाँ जहाँ ये आर्ट ऑब्जेक्ट्स जा रहे हैं, उसके बीच में एक रिश्ता है और उस हिसाब से वो बढ़ रहा है। रही बात 2000, आपके दूसरे सवाल की, 2002 के बाद और 2012, हाँ 1947 के बाद तो कई काम हुआ है। मैंने जो बताया 2 चीज़ें की, वो एक डिक्लेरेशन हुआ कि कैसे जवाहरलाल नेहरू एक बहुत एक्टिवली इनकरेज कर रहे हैं इसको, एक ऐसे बुद्धिस्ट साइट के रूप में जहाँ पर लोग आके बसे, और उन्होंने इसको एक डिप्लोमेसी के एक टूल के रूप में इस्तेमाल किया अपने रिश्ते बनाने के लिए दूसरे एशियाई देशों के साथ में। आप अगर उसके रिश्ते बनाने के लिए कर रहे हैं, और उस दौरान में इंडिया को भी एक कल्चरल सुपर पावर के रूप में प्रेजेंट कर रहे हैं। उपनिवेशवाद का खात्मा हुआ है, तो उसमें नए इंपॉर्टेंट पावर्स क्या होंगे, तो एक सॉफ्ट पावर के रूप में इंडिया का इमर्जेंस बुद्धा का बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट रोल रहा है। और उसी दौरान जो बोध गया टेम्पल एडवाइजरी कमेटी जो उसी साल बनी करने के लिए, वहाँ पर यह बताया गया कि हम जो है दूसरे देशों को टेम्पल्स को, मोनेस्ट्रीज को और गेस्ट हाउसेस को लैंड अलॉट करेंगे। और उसमें बहुत सारे प्रतिनिधि शामिल किए गए एशियाई देशों के, जहां जहां बुद्धिस्ट पॉपुलेशन थे, ताकि उनको जमीन अलॉट किया गया। इसके अलावा वो जो 2500 साल जो था बुद्धा के परिनिर्वाण को, उसको बहुत व्यापक तौर पे किया गया। 2550 साल जो था उसको भी, मतलब 2006 के आसपास में, उसको भी बहुत बड़ा सेलिब्रेट किया गया। तो ये प्रयास किया जा रहा है सरकार के द्वारा में। और फिर बाद में आप देखेंगे कि उनको 1980s के बाद में उनको ये इजाज़त भी दे दी गई कि आप जो है अपने हिसाब से अपने देश के आर्किटेक्चर स्टाइल में यहाँ पर जो मूर्ति ये बना सकते हैं। पहले मैंने बताया कि बुद्ध महाबोधि टेम्पल का मतलब है कि इसी का रेप्लिकेशन दूसरा हो रहा है। आप जाएंगे तो बिल्कुल यही दिखेगा करने के लिए। आप देख रहे हैं कि उनके स्टाइल के, तो आप निकल के जाएंगे अभी यहाँ से थोड़ा बाहर जाएंगे मंदिर की तरफ, तो कई देशों के अपने स्टाइल में आप देखेंगे टेम्पल, तो वो हो रहा है। एक बड़ी बात जिसके साथ में बात कर रहे थे, शायद आपको अभिराम ज़्यादा अच्छा बता पाएंगे, कि एक डिबेट अभी बहुत ज़ोर से चल रहा है कि वर्ल्ड हेरिटेज साइट तो हो गया और यूनेस्को का प्रेशर भी है कि भाई इस साइट को आप कैसे करेंगे, डेवलप करेंगे, तो फिर अर्बन यूज कैसे होगा। ये बात की जा रही है रीडेवलपमेंट के बारे में कि एक बफर जोन बनाना है। अब बफर जोन बनाना तो कहना आसान है, लेकिन इतने लोग जो उसके आसपास आ गए हैं वो कहाँ जाएंगे, वो क्या करेंगे, उनको कहाँ सेटलमेंट करेंगे, किस टाइप का होगा, क्योंकि ये एक सीक्रेट स्पेस है जहाँ पर हर चीज़ें, हर लोगों के लिए अलग मीनिंग होती है। जितने लोग हैं हर किसी के लिए व्यापार, बुद्ध का मतलब व्यापार है, किसी के लिए धर्म है, किसी के लिए पिलग्रिमेज है, किसी के लिए रोजी रोटी है। तो हर एक और अलग अलग इकोनॉमी से लोग जुड़ गए हैं अपने साथ में, मॉरल इकोनॉमी सबके अलग अलग हैं, लेकिन सब उस तीर्थ यात्रा में और एक बोधि ट्री के पास में इर्द गिर्द अपना जगह ढूंढ लेते हैं। वो कैसे पैन आउट करेगा, वो अभी इसको लेके विवाद चल रहा है।
We can have another one more question, I think. Okay, we'll have 2 questions and we can finish with that.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. First time I have learned about the 7 windows, and from that period, several centuries ago to the present. Wonderful. I have one or two questions here, or observation which you may want to answer or not answer. That's your choice. We can discuss it later on. I'm saying this journey of 7 windows, what happens to the philosophy of Buddha? Does it remain consistent, or does it also change over the course of time? That's one. And number 2, when you use as a soft diplomatic power, status from 53 onwards, Nehru's mention is there, has it been enlarged, the scope of that soft power, or has it dwindled on its course? What has happened to the politics of that, the soft power politics you say? And second is on the philosophy, whether the philosophy has remained consistent or it has also been altered and changed.
I have a very definite answer to the first question. The philosophy has changed over a period, not just because of Bodh Gaya, but otherwise also. Whole Buddhism, when it starts, organizing itself, when questions of documentation start coming into play, or questions of worshipping start coming into play, Buddhism has changed a lot, basically. I'll just give you, there are multiple sects within sects as well, plus it has changed as it traveled to different countries as well, right? But broadly speaking, I can just tell you about the 3 versions, but within that, as I said, and there were many other versions, is that, these were not schools for some time, because monks would coexist at various Buddhist sites. So Hinayana or Mahana, something which stuck to it, basically. Monks who thought that these are the original teachings, basically. So they stuck to that. One of example is the Southern school of Buddhism, or the Theravada school of Buddhism, or Hinayana, as you would like to call him more broadly. These terms, but larger philosophies remain the same. But also because 2nd, 3rd centuries AD, there is a new way in which Buddha is being interpreted. So there is a new school of thought which says that, that Buddha, there were Buddhas before that Buddha. So the idea of Bodhisattva starts becoming important. Now Bodhisattva was important earlier as well, because if you read the Jataka stories, Bodhisattvas appear in the form of humans, animals, birds, basically different kinds, and they come as saviors, basically. Right? And then under the Mahayana school, this idea also came that, look, if bodhisattvas were there earlier, they would be there later as well. So the whole idea is that that person does not choose to go in for salvation, but waits for other people to come on board. So the idea of Buddha sometimes is seen in that school as that this is not how a Buddha could be. This looks like a very selfish idea, that you attained your own salvation. So the idea of bodhisattvas start coming into being. Along with that, and who waits for other people to gain salvation. And along with that comes the idea of transference of merit. So merit could be transferred. I could work on your behalf. So if you look at the various sites of Buddhist sites across, there are the donors, they are recording their names in the inscriptions. So they say that, look, I am donating this part, so this carving is being donated by me, so I am gaining merit. Now I can transfer that merit to my father and my mother. So the idea of transference of merit also becomes important. And later, during the Gupta times and all the 6th century, 7th century, 8th century, this whole idea when you have Tantricism at the same time, when you're having Sakti and Tantricism cult in what would be called the Brahmanical Hinduism, what is also seeing is that how Tantric ideas are also influencing Buddhism as well. So Nalanda, Tibet, all those become center and transferring to that, or Nepal, for instance, the Vajrayana starts coming into being, basically. Right? So Tara, other gods, become very important in that case. So first question, very simple answer that yes, it has been changing, and I have just give you only a small idea of change. But the change is more pervasive. There are regional manifestations, basically in changing. So there is evidence of monks who were supposed to be, they would beg and basically live on that as a livelihood. They would not work. So if you look at Sanchi, they were involved in irrigation. The monks were involved in irrigation. If you look at further down in Deccan, they were also involved in trade. Basically monks are involved in trade. So whole idea is changing depending on what are the local configurations, not just internally but also externally. And the second one is that I think it has an idea is a potential idea, and it is trying to grow also because this means investment, this means tourism, this means greater income. So that is the thing. But somewhere I have a feeling that they have not got their act together basically to think in terms of what we were discussing in the morning, in terms of a kind of a very holistic redevelopment scheme, which could offer spaces to different players, to different stakeholders. And then you could think about it in a more futuristic term. That part is important.
If there is time, I can ask.
Yeah, there's another time. Sometime you can take a question.
So, first of all, thank you for your wonderful and very comprehensive presentation. I was just thinking in terms of methodological terms, like the 7 frames which you have chosen. Initially, and the way you have used sources. So if I'm correct, like one of the major sources are travelogue. So first is travelogue, and then there are artifacts, and then there are the relationship between the tangible and the intangible. So that was like really wonderful. But in terms of framing, initially like you have talked about how it has traveled within the region, and then in the later frames you have moved too much towards the outer world, and especially towards the eastern side of Bodh Gaya, like in international border terms. And in the process, like, I don't know whether it was deliberate or was it because of like lack of resources, that you have not engaged with like what has happened within the boundaries of South Asia. So what the questions, like what the points they were trying to raise. So like how these things have moved within India. For instance, like towards Mathura, or towards Afghanistan, or like in Maharashtra, or even in Andhra or Telangana region. Because recently, like many Buddhist scholars are even now tracing the networks. Like normally when we talk about Buddhism, we assume Lumbini and Sarnath and Bodh Gaya. But then there is way beyond than this. So was it because of the decline of like Buddhism in the 9th to 13th century, or like what was happening during that period within the country? So that's also an important question. If that can come more profoundly in your like presentation, I think that will make it more enriching. Thank you.
Thank you. I think 2 questions. First question, let me tell you. I was using the tangible heritage as my entry point, right? So sources come in, the written accounts only come in from, say 5th to 8th centuries and 13th centuries. Where I'm talking about this movement, during this movement, they are not only leaving behind accounts and inscriptions, but also carrying this. So the whole idea of Bodh Gaya is also getting the first sense of globalized, basically, right? So I'm talking about tangible heritage as my primary evidence, and these 7 windows I used for basically a simplification of the lecture. You could use 15 windows, or you could 8 windows or 10 windows, basically. So you could do any windows. I was being conscious about the fact that not everybody in this hall would be, a history person, basically, or having, this thing. So I used it for simplified talk. So many of the things I couldn't cover, or I didn't cover intentionally, because that is not. The second part is, to your question is, and builds on his question, is about South Asia. I was making a very clear distinction between Buddhism, spread of Buddhism, and Bodh Gaya itself. So I'm only limiting my discussion to where you have tangible remains of Bodh Gaya which is being found. Right? So Buddhism spread, and that is in no way in any way negating that. But I'm only talking because this is Bodh Gaya Dialogues, and I thought that I'll only speak about Bodh Gaya and how this whole idea of Bodh Gaya is traveling worldwide, or based on wherever we have got evidence from. So in no way do I amount to say that, it's not traveling eastwards. I talked about, Western India and Deccan, but this very Northwest has a very rich tradition. Afghanistan, Gandhara region has a very great tradition of Buddhism. But I am talking mostly about from the Bodh Gaya, the symbols, the idea, how this idea or symbols associated with Bodh Gaya get disseminated, basically. So in terms of exact tangible remains. So you would have noticed that I'm not getting into other parts of Buddhism, right? Unless and until last. So I'm very clear that, Bodh Gaya for me is the metaphor, is the symbol, is the meaning, is the motive. And how use this Bodh Gaya as a motive, as an idea, to talk about larger geocultural connections. That's my methodology.
By that you mean like it has not traveled in the same way in the western or other parts of India?
No, I never would imply that.
The tangible or the stories?
I talked about Western India in terms of replication of the Bodh Gaya tree shrine at Sanchi and Bharut.
Yes.
Right? I also talked about how the legend of Sujata has this thing not only there, or Mara is being depicted in elsewhere. Ajanta, for instance, has paintings. So I talked about that in a part. Right? But I'm only using symbols or motifs which are directly connected with Bodh Gaya. And therefore I began saying that, how at Bodh Gaya, the intangible is becoming tangible. And therefore I'm using those motifs, and how are those motifs being reproduced in other contexts, and only talking about those contexts as opposed to general Buddhism spread.
Thank you so much, sir. I think this has been a very catching hold of you and talking to you about all the 7 windows. Let's carry this on forward during the lunch hour. As an announcement, we will not be having the tea break, and we will move on to the next session. So thank you so much once again, Dr. Shekhar, for the talk, and thank you all. We will take a 1-minute break, and we will begin with the next session.